Lion stuck in a bottle couldn't eat for 5 days. What happened next is unbelievable. The massive form lay motionless beside the dried riverbed, and for a moment, Ranger David Kumalo thought he was looking at a carcass. Then he noticed the shallow rise and fall of the animal's flanks, the desperate rhythm of labored breathing that spoke of a creature clinging to the edge of survival. A large plastic container, the kind used for industrial chemicals, encased the lion's entire head like a grotesque helmet, its opening pressed tight against his neck, where repeated attempts to remove it had worn the fur away to raw, bleeding skin. David approached on foot, leaving his vehicle a safe distance away, each step measured and deliberate across the cracked earth. The lion's condition was immediately apparent. His ribs showed clearly through a golden coat that had lost its luster, and his powerful hindquarters trembled with the weakness that comes from days without food or water. The plastic container bore scratches and dents from the animal's desperate attempts to free himself, evidence of a struggle that had lasted far longer than any creature should have to endure. The ranger had seen similar incidents before, the tragic consequence of human waste finding its way into wildlife corridors. Lions, drawn by the scent of food residue or simply curious about unfamiliar objects, would sometimes force their heads into containers, only to discover that their backward-pointing teeth and the shape of their skulls made withdrawal impossible. This lion had likely been trapped for days, perhaps a week, based on his severely weakened condition and the extent of the wounds around his neck. Radio static crackled as David contacted the veterinary response team, his voice deliberately calm despite the urgency of the situation. Dr. Sarah Malel and her colleague would need at least 2 hours to reach this remote location near the Tanzanian border, time that this lion might not have. His breathing had become increasingly shallow, and his attempts to lift his head had grown weaker since David's arrival. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the black plastic, creating an oven-like environment that added heat exhaustion to the list of life-threatening complications. The lion's body language spoke of complete exhaustion. His tail lay still in the dust, and his massive paws had stopped clawing at the container that held him prisoner. Only the steady rise and fall of his sides indicated that life still flickered within this magnificent predator who had been reduced to helpless suffering by human negligence. Flies had begun to gather around the wounds on his neck, adding another layer of misery to his already desperate situation. David settled into position 20 meters away, close enough to monitor the animal's condition, but far enough to avoid adding stress through proximity. The lion seemed barely aware of his presence, conserved energy making even awareness a luxury he could ill afford. Occasionally, a soft whimper escaped from within the plastic prison, a sound so heartbreaking that it seemed to carry across the empty landscape like a prayer. "Hold on there, big fellow," David whispered, knowing the words were more for his own comfort than the lion's understanding. The afternoon stretched endlessly as they waited for help to arrive. Predator and protector sharing the same patch of unforgiving earth, bound together by circumstance and the fragile thread of hope that still connected this mighty creature to life. Dr. Sarah Molell arrived as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, her veterinary kit and portable equipment carried efficiently across the dusty ground by her assistant, Mark. The lion had not moved in the hour since their radio contact, his breathing now so shallow that David had to watch closely to confirm signs of life. Sarah's experienced eye took in the scene immediately, the degree of dehydration evident in the animal's sunken flanks, the infected wounds around his neck where the plastic had chafed for days, and the critical positioning of the container that made any rescue attempt potentially fatal if handled incorrectly. The veterinary team worked with the methodical precision that comes from years of wildlife emergency response. Sarah prepared a mild sedative, calculating the dosage for an animal whose exact weight could only be estimated in his weakened state. The tranquilizer dart found its mark in the lion's hindquarter, and within minutes, his already labored breathing settled into the deeper rhythm of medicated sleep. Even unconscious, his body maintained the tension of an animal that had fought for survival longer than should have been possible. Mark positioned himself at the lion's head, while Sarah examined the container more closely. The plastic had warped slightly from heat and the animal's struggles, creating a seal that would require careful cutting to avoid injury to the lion's face and eyes. The industrial-grade material was thick and resistant, designed to withstand years of chemical exposure, never intended to become a death trap for one of Africa's most magnificent predators. Using a specialized cutting tool designed for wildlife rescue operations, Sarah began the delicate process of creating relief cuts in the plastic. Each incision had to be perfectly placed. Too shallow, and the container would remain intact. Too deep, and the blade might puncture the lion's skull or damage his eyes. The work proceeded in millimeters, with frequent pauses to check the animal's vital signs and reposition the cutting angle. Mark maintained gentle pressure on the container to prevent it from shifting as the structural integrity weakened with each cut. 40 minutes passed before Sarah felt confident enough to attempt removal. The container had been sectioned into careful strips that could be peeled away like the petals of some industrial flower. As the first piece of plastic lifted free, the lion's mane became visible, matted with sweat and debris, but intact. His ears, pressed flat against his skull for so long, slowly began to resume their natural position as the pressure released. The moment of complete liberation came with surprising gentleness. The final section of container lifted away to reveal a face marked by suffering but free of the serious injuries they had feared. His nose was raw and swollen from pressing against the plastic, and his eyes showed the cloudiness of severe dehydration, but no permanent damage was immediately apparent. The lion's first unobstructed breath came as a soft sigh that seemed to carry days of trapped desperation. "There you go, old man," Sarah whispered, her gloved hands carefully examining his face and neck for injuries. What happened next defied every expectation based on their experience with traumatized wildlife. As the sedative began to wear off and consciousness returned, the lion's amber eyes focused on Sarah with something that seemed remarkably close to recognition. When she approached to clean his wounds, he remained completely still, his massive head resting on the ground in a posture of complete trust rather than the defensive alertness typical of wildcats under stress. The gentle giant who had endured unimaginable suffering showed no aggression toward the humans who had freed him, only a profound stillness that spoke of exhaustion, relief, and perhaps something deeper than survival instinct could explain. As Sarah administered fluids through an IV line, the lion's condition began to stabilize with remarkable speed. The rehydration brought color back to his gums and clarity to his amber eyes, but something in his posture suggested an urgency that went beyond his own recovery. Every few minutes he would lift his massive head slightly and direct his attention toward a cluster of rocks about 50 meters to the east. Making soft vocalizations that seemed more like calls than expressions of distress, David followed the lion's gaze, studying the rocky outcropping with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades reading animal behavior. The terrain appeared unremarkable, scattered boulders and scrub vegetation typical of this semi-arid landscape, but the lion's consistent focus suggested otherwise. When the big cat attempted to rise despite his weakness, Sarah gently restrained him while Mark decided to investigate the area that had captured the animal's attention. The discovery came as 3 small forms emerged from beneath an overhanging rock ledge, moving with the uncertain steps of very young cubs. They were perhaps 8 weeks old, their spotted coats dusty from days spent hiding in their makeshift den. The largest of the 3 made tentative mewing sounds toward the lion, who responded with deep, reassuring rumbles that carried across the distance between them. These were not just any cubs. Their facial features and coloring clearly identified them as this lion's offspring. The behavioral pattern suddenly made heartbreaking sense. This male lion had remained near his trapped condition, not out of inability to move, but out of an instinctive drive to protect his vulnerable young. Male lions rarely exhibit such devoted parental behavior, typically leaving cub rearing entirely to females. Yet here was evidence of paternal sacrifice that defied conventional understanding of lion social structure. He had chosen to stay close to his cubs rather than search for water or food, accepting his own suffering to ensure their safety. Sarah and her team worked quickly to provide nourishment for both father and offspring. The cubs, emboldened by their father's calm acceptance of human presence, approached cautiously as bowls of milk formula were placed near their hiding spot. Their father watched each movement with protective awareness, his strength returning as he witnessed his cubs feeding for the first time in days. The veterinary team maintained respectful distance, understanding that they were observing something extraordinary, a demonstration of love that transcended species boundaries and challenged scientific assumptions about wild animal behavior. As evening approached and the immediate medical crisis passed, the lion rose slowly to his feet. His movements were still careful, but determined as he approached his cubs with the measured steps of a devoted parent. The three small forms clustered around his legs, their purrs barely audible but unmistakably content as they reunited with the father who had sacrificed everything for their survival. "Look at that," David whispered, watching the family group move together toward the shelter of the rocks. The last light of day painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber as the lion led his cubs away from the place of his captivity and toward whatever future awaited them in the wild. Behind them, the discarded plastic container lay forgotten in the dust, a reminder of human carelessness transformed into a testament of parental devotion that would remain with the rescue team forever.